Hey, what's up guys? Nate here from Protoculture and Shadow Chronicles. Welcome back to Sonic Academy. Today we're talking about loudness. So chances are if you've been producing for a little while, you've heard the term loudness war come up a number of times. So before the sort of rise of streaming services, there was a massive amount of competition to get your mixes as loud as possible. So after all, the human ear perceives the loudest signal as being the better quality one. So there was always this massive push to get the output levels of your master as loud as possible so that you'd always be a step above the competition. So this did have some negative effects on the music industry at the time. It kind of resulted in a lot of lifeless mixes that were kind of squashed to death as boundaries were kind of pushed further and further. So enter the age of the streaming service. So companies like Spotify and iTunes started automating attenuation on masters, kind of the same way that audio had been governed by broadcast standards in television, for example, whereby mixes needed to be a specific level for them to be aired. Spotify and iTunes, in the case of Spotify, for example, would turn down your audio to minus 14 LUFS or LUFS for it to be accepted onto the platform. So the result is that the physical loudness of all tracks is pretty much the same. This is great for when you're listening to, say, acoustic material and followed by a dance track, for example. The levels physically don't change at all. So that's it, right? So striving for loud mixes should be irrelevant. Well, no, not quite. It's not quite as simple as that. See, there's two kinds of loudness that you should be paying attention to. The physical loudness, or the sort of peak output level of your track, as well as perceived loudness. There's a number of psychoacoustic effects, the way that the human ear perceives audio, as well as some other concepts pertaining to dynamics and headroom, the way that recording formats work, and so on, that need to be considered and that will essentially result in a perceptibly louder mix, despite the fact that the levels are the same at the output. So this is particularly important when it comes down to the genre that you're working in. You don't really want to stick an instance of OTT and slam the life out of a folk ballad. Much in the same way, you don't want to have a super gentle and dynamic mix of a dubstep track. So there's a number of different ways that you can create perceived loudness in a track. Everything from sound design right up to the arrangement is going to make a difference. This video, I'm focusing just on the kind of mix side of things. So the main premise of getting sort of perceptibly loud mixes is maximizing the amount of headroom that you have available in the track. And things like EQ, dynamics, saturation are kind of going to be your best friends in this regard. So let's check out 5 tools that I use quite a bit. These are 5 of my favorite plugins for achieving perceived loudness in my mixes. Let's check these out. Right, so the first plugin I'm going to look at, you may find a bit of a strange pick because it doesn't actually affect the audio at all, but that's tonal balance control from iZotope. It comes with Neutron or Ozone. We've covered these extensively on Sonic Academy's website as well. But the reason I put this here is because one of the most important factors to getting a perceptibly loud mix is making sure that the balance in your overall EQ is correct. Quite often we tend to not focus enough on the mid-range, and this really kind of just puts things in perspective and kind of just points out errors that you may have made. I often tend to mix things slightly too bright or a little bit too bass heavy and not focus enough on these mid-range areas. And what this does, I've just loaded this on the master, will give you a sort of representation of where your frequencies should be balanced more. Now, this is just a project that I've just started. It's pretty much just a sketch at this point, so the mix is kind of all over the place. I've loaded up the EDM profile here. You can load up your own profiles that you take from reference tracks, for example. Let's just see where we are in this mix currently. And you can immediately see my tops are way too loud, and there's a severe lack of low mid-range stuff going on here. Now, the low mid-range is one of those areas. I know that you're kind of told to often pull out muddy frequencies and things, but a lot of energy sits in this area here, and that's often where a lot of the sort of perceived loudness comes from. So in this case, running this mix into the mastering stage is going to give me a hard time when I'm trying to get that mix as loud as possible. So just to kind of demonstrate this, I'm going to run this through a limiter now, just so we have a even volume. And then I'm going to enable an instance of shade. So this is a pretty extreme example, like very quickly just put together. Ideally, you don't want to be doing this with a single EQ at the mastering phase, but just for the sake of demonstration here, just take a listen to the perceived loudness now when I start boosting these low mids and some of the high mids as well. Take out a little bit of the highs and a little bit of the lows. I'm essentially balancing it out. I might be maybe pushing a little bit more into the limiter than it was before, but just take a listen to the difference now when I enable this EQ. That's without. So again, not an ideal example, but you can really kind of hear that sort of power and energy coming out through the low mids now as well. So this tool for me, really, really useful just for kind of making sure that I'm in the right ballpark when it comes to my sort of spread of frequencies in the mix. And it's going to help you solve a lot of problems when it comes to getting your mixes nice and loud. Right, so of course dynamics plays a massive part, as I'm sure you know, when it comes down to creating loud mixes. You want to keep those levels in control. The more you kind of compress peaks and low points in your audio together, the more headroom you're essentially generating for yourself. So one way that you can do this really well is by layering compression. If you stick all the signal through one compression and compress too hard, you tend to squash things and that affects your tracks negatively. So a great trick is to layer up different compressors either in parallel or in serial as well, and play around with different tones from different compressors with different settings to address different areas of the audio that you're working with. Now, you can pretty much do this with any series of compressors, and there's a number of other different plugins like this as well, but I've been using Mixbox from IK Multimedia quite a bit lately. The reason why I like this is it makes it really simple to load up a string of different compressors and play around with blending them together. So you kind of address small little bits of that audio, like I said, without kind of overdriving a compressor too much. And this is really cool. You can just kind of load up. There's a nice selection of sort of classics in here, like the bus compressor, the SSL bus comp, British Dynamics I've got in here, normal compressor as well. We can also just stick a limiter on the end here to handle any peaks if we wanted to as well. And just really simple to kind of experiment with moving things around as well. We can just drag these around to play with the sort of order of the plugins. If you click down here, you also have dry wet mix dials for each of these, so you can do a bit of parallel compression. Then, of course, you've also got a number of other different effects like EQs and stuff, which you can also work with and build channel strips. But I just find having them all in one interface like this is really, really nice to have. In this case, I've just set up a little bit of a blend of compressors on my drum bus, so we can kind of just listen to that. And I've dialed in some compression. Just to kind of fill up those drums a little bit more, glue them together. It's really simple as well to kind of just match the outputs here with the ins and outs on this side. And of course, you've also got gains for each of the compression stages here as well. And this can be expanded into 8 plugins in total inside of Mixbox. So some other ones that you might want to look at, like this is the Slate virtual mix rack. It's also the same kind of concept, which is really nice to play around with to kind of create these blends of compression to really bring that mix out. So next on the list, this one's a bit of a secret weapon plugin. I can't quite tell you exactly what this is doing. I've done my research and tried to figure this out. I've never come across anything that sounds quite the same as this. It is a combination of clipping and some other processing going on. It's very kind of ambiguous as to what actually happens inside of this thing. There's been quite a few discussions around this, but it just has the most amazing ability to make things just pop out and just sound loud and in your face. We're going to take a listen to this now. We'll take a look at it without. And what I usually do is I dial the effect up, and then the curve, we'll dial the effect all the way up, and then the curve kind of bring that up. So it's kind of like a wave shaping algorithm almost, but like I said, there's some other sort of stuff happening in the background here. So just take a listen to the difference now. So when you bring the volume down a little bit just to kind of match the levels of them so you can hear slightly more accurately what's going on. So you can see our peak is pretty much staying the same there, but just listen to how much louder it sounds and how much more in your face that mix is now as soon as we enable that plugin. And while the peak's remaining the same, you can see the RMS is actually coming up as well. So it's definitely kind of just adding a lot more of that sort of energy and loudness into your mix. So this one for sure, total secret weapon plugin. This really, really great addition to have. It just does some magic to your mix. It's one of those rare sort of 1 or 2 dial plugins that just kind of adds something really special without too much work at all. Super simple to use and totally worth adding to your arsenal. This. Right, so another fantastic plugin for getting sort of more loudness out of your mixes as well is using a clipper. And I used to use a free plugin called Clip Shifter for a while, and I've kind of moved on to Sir Audio Standard Clip. It's super cheap, this. You can pick this up for, I think, $25, I believe it is. And it essentially is a limiter. Clippers are essentially a limiter, but instead of pulling the volume down like a limiter or compressor would, this essentially just cuts it off the top. So essentially you're distorting your signal, and it's fantastic just for squeezing that little bit of extra headroom whilst actually adding a bit of sort of vibration to your sounds as well. Because remember, it is distorting. You can enable a soft clip as well if you don't want it to be as abrasive as normal. But let's just take a look. So a really good place to use this is on percussion, for example. We have a lot of transients. We'll play that back. And we can dial in some of the clip. And we want to just be aiming for the top transients there. And you can see the signal coming out of there now. It's becoming more and more kind of compressed together, whilst adding a little bit of that distortion into it. Just kind of creates a slightly harder sound to everything. You do want to be careful with these. You normally clip too much. I'll take a listen to what happens when you do pull this all the way down. You can hear that's essentially just distorting everything now. But adding a little bit of that just to the peaks. Just look at the waveform there again. And just look how everything kind of comes together. So essentially what you're doing here is those peaks, by however much you're dropping those peaks with the clipper, that's how much headroom you are creating for your mix. So this drum bass could essentially be pushed up. Let's see if we're doing sort of like 1 or 2 dBs worth of clipping on there. You can essentially pull up this drum bass by 2 dBs of gain without actually driving your limiter any harder. So it just makes everything a lot easier to push into the limiter. At the end of the day, your dynamics are kind of in control. And then obviously with the added bonus of adding in that slight hardness to your sound through the distortion that's occurring on this one. This one also does a pretty high sample rates, just like Casro K-Clip. You can go all the way up to 256 oversampling. So this is also a great alternative to sort of true peak mastering limiters as well. Because of the high oversampling rate that you have available here, you can make sure that you're not getting any of those intersample peaks as well in the mastering phase. So this is a fantastic little plugin. Like I said, it's really inexpensive and a very, very cool addition to have, especially when it comes to trying to squeeze a little bit more perceived loudness out of your mixes. Right, so the last one that I want to look at is one of my favorite distortion plugins, and I've been using this for a while. However, there is a brand new version out now. That's the Black Box Analog Designs HG2. This is the MS version, which has just come out from Plugin Alliance. Essentially what this one does is it is slightly modified from the original. You now have some additional filters and stuff for the saturation, but you have two of these models now that can be run concurrently on the left and right, and it can also be put into an MS mode, so you can affect the sides differently from the mids, which gives you a huge amount of control over what you are saturating in your mix. So one of the reasons I just wanted to briefly explain why saturation is such an important part in getting loud mixes. We've spoken about EQ and how mid-range content is often what the ear is more sensitive to and often what is perceived louder. I'm just going to stick a test generator before this. And let's just take a look at the output on a scope. Right, so we're just going to take a look at the sine wave first. And you can see a pure sine wave now. We're getting this frequency down at the bottom. And it's a low-end frequency. But what happens when we start dialing in saturation? And I'm going to push this quite hard now just to show you what I mean. We'll dial in some of the saturation here as well. Take a look at the scope when I re-enable the sine wave. And you can see in this extreme example now, you can see all that mid-range content being generated from harmonics and the signal being saturated. And that's really why saturation works so well when it comes to trying to mix tracks with more perceived loudness, is it's generating more of that content that wasn't there through added harmonics and distortion. So adding this in clever places around your mix can really kind of just beef up everything a huge amount, particularly with low-end stuff. I mean, we can dial this in. I use this quite often on the master bus as well, and we'll just take a listen to that quickly. We'll dial in some saturation and bring up the pentode, which is the even harmonics, and a little bit of the triode as well. So they're relatively evenly matched now. You can kind of just hear how much more of that kind of aggressiveness this kind of adds to your mix. It has a tendency to kind of create a slightly more three-dimensional space as well. Definitely one of the best and definitely one of my favorite saturation plugins on the market at the moment, the Black Box Analog Designs HG2 MS from Plugin Alliance. Right, so that's it. Obviously, as I said, there is a whole lot more to getting perceived loudness in your tracks, right from things like sound design and arrangement and so forth. Even stuff like reverb can make a difference to the perceived loudness of a track that you're working on. But hopefully these will just be a few plugins that you can go and check out, which will aid you on the mix side of things. So just remember to be focusing on those dynamics, saturation and EQ, and to really focus on adding these layers, you know, be it dynamics or small amounts of saturation in various places at gradual intervals throughout your gain staging, which will all kind of come together at the end to kind of produce this way more perceptively louder mix. Right, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will be back soon right here at Sonic Academy. Till then, take care. Cheers.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate all the support from you guys. If you love this video, then smash a like, and if you want to be notified about new videos, hit the subscribe and notification buttons. Peace!